place to be is living free in Tennessee.
Welcome to Living Free in Tennessee, where we talk about building the life you choose on your terms. Today is Thursday, February 27th, and this is episode 1010 of Living Free in Tennessee. And it's a Monday show on a Thursday. I traveled over the weekend. Hello, John Halfley. Welcome to the live stream. I traveled over the weekend and came back to an unfortunate pasture event and ended up processing a ewe on Monday and decided I would do a better job on this show if I delayed it till Thursday, so I had my head screwed on straight again. Anyway, today we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how making small changes can have really big results. And I'm going to tell you the story of what happened when we had flooding in the barn about 2 weeks ago after a major rain event in Tennessee, and how we remediated that with some small changes. So we'll go over that. I did make a video of what we did earlier today, but Tactical did it with his phone and then left to go get something at a town 45 minutes from here. So I was hoping to actually play that on here. And I guess we will just be putting that video out later today on YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, all the places, TikTok. I'm also going to cover our usual Monday segments, even though it's a Thursday, because we haven't done those in a bit. Before I do that, though, I do want to talk about the featured event, and it's this Sunday at 12 p.m. in Kentucky. It's the Bluebird Hill Farm Open House. Boy, can I just do a do-over on that, guys? It's the Blueberry Hill Open House, which will be at Carrie Brown's house from Strong Roots Resources. I've got a link in the show notes all about the event. I've been to one of these. They're really great. Carrie does, a property walk if you're interested in seeing all the permaculture systems he's set up. Usually there's a potluck, and you can even trade stuff if you bring stuff. It's a good time, but the best thing about it is that you connect with other homesteaders who have similar interests, right? So check that out. I've got a link at Living Free in Tennessee in our event calendar for you to connect with Carrie and check out the open house gathering. I also want to thank two sponsors today. Our first sponsor is the Wealth Studying Podcast. That's John Pagliano of the Wealth Studying Podcast. John is a superb individual, really great dude, very empowering of everybody in our network. And I've known him since very early on in my podcast journey. Well, when we launched sponsorships, he jumped right on board and has been supportive of the podcast since our very beginning. He also has a podcast called the Wealth Studying Podcast, where you can go listen to how he's making investment decisions. And when he talks about his passion, which is making money, it makes you want to also make money, which is not a bad thing to expose yourself to now, is it? Check that out at thewealthstudyingpodcast.com. If you want to meet John Pagliano in person, he will be speaking at the Living Free in Tennessee Spring Workshop in April. Our second sponsor of today's show is EMP Shield. EMP Shield makes a whole house protection device that will protect you against surges and other variances in electricity. It's very easy to install on your breaker board. I've got one installed on the electric power to my roasting shack and swim spa. And then I've also got one installed on the whole house here. And so I had an electrician installed, and it took him like 5 minutes. And when he opened the package, he's like, now I understand why these are considered the best in the market for this purpose. If they fail, you have a $25,000 replacement insurance policy on appliances and other things that get hurt if you have an incident. Like, I don't know, a tree falls and causes a power surge to go down your line, which takes out your transformer, which then zaps stuff in your house. I mean, that didn't happen recently to anybody around here or anything. Or a car hits a telephone pole and boom, big problems. Or lightning. Lightning's the thing that happens most around me, but that's just because we have fun weather. So check them out, empshield.com. Coupon code LFTN will get you $50 off the device of your choice. Okay, before we move on to our first segment today, I do want to remind you, you can send me questions and feedback to Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com. I've been getting a few emails from people, none that I felt were appropriate for reading on the show, but sometimes you ask me a question that I think, you know what, this would be really great for folks to hear. And then I pop it out on the show. So that's Nicole at livingfreeintennessee.com, or you can go to livingfreeintennessee.com, click on contact, and those emails go directly to me. And I'm keeping up on my email this year. So that's been kind of cool. Next up, we have Tales from the Prepper Pantry. This is where we talk about storing what you use and using what you store. And I don't have a lot here. As I said, I was on the road, but we did process 2 ewes since last Saturday for unfortunate reasons. Hello, Scott. Welcome. And I now have a lot of lamb meat in my fridge. So that is something that I'll be putting up as ground lamb. But I think I'm going to experiment with making some lamb sausage. So that's going to be coming in the future. But it's an unfortunate part of raising livestock that sometimes you discover an animal should not be passing its genetics on, and you need to process them, which happened here. And you make the best of it, and you fill up your pantry a little bit more. That's just the deal. So I'm gonna have lots of ground lamb in summary. So they were just under a year old, and a little older than I'd want to have like lamb chops from and leg of lamb. The meat on animals tends to get tougher as they get older. And at the store, they will still serve you that lamb at, year and a half old. I'm a fan of 9 months being the cutoff point, which means that my sheep will be a little younger, which means a little less weight on them when we process them, but it's really tender, really tasty. So that's the deal. So yeah, I am playing around with recipes with ground lamb. I'm also going to do a Scotch egg recipe experiment today. I just peeled the hard-boiled eggs for that, and I wonder where my chicken flour is. I ordered chicken flour and it should be here. So I should go look for that. But what that is like dried chicken breast ground up. So we're doing a hard-boiled egg with a coating of spiced meat around it, like ground meat, and baking that that's been rolled in chicken flour. And I want to see how they taste, and then I want to freeze them, thaw them, and heat them and see if they taste good that way too, because I was planning to do these at the spring workshop, but I would love it if I could pre-make the Scotch eggs. So they just need to be heated carefully and served rather than having to put them together on site for whoever ends up running my kitchen, which I'll talk about that in a second too. I'm also embarking on taking one of my beef round roasts out of the freezer and defrosting it. And I get the whole eye of round and making it into roast beef sandwich meat with the sous vide. So I'm going to do that by doing sort of a marinade for it. And then I'm going to sous vide it for 24 hours or so, maybe 22 hours. It depends on how big it is. Then get it really cold in the fridge. Like let it sit for a couple days, which is what Spirko told me to do when I was talking to him about doing this. He's like, yeah, the key is after you've cooked it in the sous vide, you let it sit and then slice it thin. Now, before I even throw it in the sous vide, I'll sear it. So while it's still raw, sear, and then do the roast beef. And we'll see how that is. I've really been getting interested in making more lunch meats because we do a lot of charcuterie platters in the afternoon when we want a snack. And I end up buying cured meats, and I have a lot of meat that I could be curing here. So I'm sort of embarking more on the meat curing side of my life. Other than that, the prepper pantry is not making forward progress this week, but next week we've got another round. So next week we're moving where the utilities are in there so that we can get into the final part of redoing the prepper pantry, seal the floor, build the shelves, and then finally, after like 6 months of having this torn apart and all my stuff outside under a carport, I can start having a more balanced pantry. I've been working as best as I can with sort of chaos going on, but I am actually so excited to have my shelves back. You can't even imagine how excited I am for that. It's a dumb thing, but when your home is like the source of your strength and your home falls into disarray, which mine has, I have not managed this well, having all my stuff everywhere. It's just like every time you need something, you're like, okay, is it in the basement next door? Is it out there? Did I stash it somewhere in the house because it couldn't freeze? Like my breakfast bar has all of my paint stored under it, for example. Like at my feet are gallons of paint I didn't want to have freeze. And that's just too much chaos. And I just like, I really, really, really have developed a lot of sympathy for people in tiny spaces who are having to stick things everywhere that they can find a spot for it, because keeping track of all that is a whole lot more work than if you just have a simple shelving system where the old stuff is, you load from the back and take from the front, basically. Like the oldest stuff is easiest to get. And then I go actually side to side personally on my shelves. So it's like, this is old, this is new. So I'll pull from that side and then everything works out. And every so often I just double check that we don't have a stray cat in there somewhere where, a 2024 jar has ended up mixed with the 2025s, for example. So anyway, that's how the pantry's going. And I suspect, so in my head, I think we'll be done with the pantry in 2 weeks. But in my reality, I'm hoping by the end of March. Yeah, Scott says first in, first out. Yep, that's the best way to do your pantry. I do that with my canned goods too. And it's my canned goods that made me go side to side, because I have storage that's just one jar deep. I'm pointing at it, but you can't see it. But it's like this shelf along the top of my house, where at the very back of the house is where I start loading canned goods in when I start canning season, which is starting very soon. And about this time of year, because I also keep things by like all the tomatoes in one place, all the green beans in another place as best I can. This time of year, there's like spaces between those things because we've been using the canned goods for the winter. And it's time for me to go and assess where we're at, so that I know if there are any 2023 jars, because it's 2024 that's the most recent canning season. So any 2023 jars I then take out and make really super readily accessible. That's coming. That's what I do around spring equinox thingy that's happening. Like, is it solstice or the equinox? It's the solstice. So spring solstice is happening this month, and that's about when I'm like, oh yeah, it's time to audit the canned goods and make sure I don't, leave one for too long, and then start planning meals around them. Plus, we've been eating mostly carnivore here. So I did a keto week this week, but I'm going back to carnivore again. So we're just not using the canned goods as quickly. And that means I need to assess what I put up for next year, because of course your pantry should totally empower you to have what you need and use what you have. But if you suddenly stop using as many tomatoes, which is, I'm guilty of that, then maybe I just save my tomatoes for fresh in the summer, or work with another homesteader who I can trade with. Don't know. We will see. But I suspect that the next 12 months of eating are going to be very similar to this 12 months, where it's been more of a meat heavy diet. I've got a frugality tip in my next segment from Margot. And Margot says the following, and this is speaking to my heart, because I've been in this situation a lot. So, stopping in the middle of a project when you run out of something and having to go get something to finish the project can be annoying, right? So, what's more annoying to me, though, is wasting time to save $1 or two. While I'm probably one of the most frugal people I know with money, I value my time a lot as well. So, when saving some time costs me $2 more, I'm willing to run to the closer, more expensive option to spend two more dollars and get the task done. And the example she gave is she was painting some yard furniture, ran out of Rust-Oleum, and the store for Rust-Oleum was an extra half hour away from the closer store where it cost more, like the store for Rust-Oleum where it was cheaper. And she was like, I'm just going to spend two more dollars because it'll take me an hour to save that $2. And then if I pay myself even $10 an hour, that ROI doesn't work out. Guys, this is a really important thing, because I love building frugality into my life. I love using systems that help me save by cooking from scratch, for example. That saves a ton. And we eat like kings here. But at the same time, sometimes it makes sense to spend the more money to do things the right way, or to not spend as much time sourcing the cheapest possible option. And that we experience this with animal feed a lot, right? Where I'm pretty picky about feed, and we've been spending $22 a bag on an organic feed for our ducks. And the reason we were doing that is I could have saved a few dollars a bag, but it was in another state. And so it just did not make sense for us to do that. Well, now that we have a new feed source here that's an even higher quality feed than the one I'd been sourcing, it's a 2-hour drive to them. So now I can build that system in, and once a month or once every other month, I can go buy a whole bunch, like 20 bags at once. It's a 4-hour time investment, and I get it. It's $17 a bag instead of $24 a bag. So that's a decent savings, but what's more important is the quality on that. And it's a quality of feed I've been wanting to have for years, that the only other place I knew where I could get it was Texas, which is an even longer drive. So that's something to think about when you're getting very frugal. Is it's not always about how cheap is it. It's also about the value and the tax on your time, basically. Our next segment is Operation Independence. This is where we talk about building local ongoing revenue into our lives here at the Holler Homestead, as well as taking steps to build frugality into your life, avoiding the need to pay a guy. And this year, I've done something better than I usually do, and that is my seedlings. I usually just nail it on peppers and tomato seedlings because I really don't want to have those things. I have specific varieties where I've been saving seeds for over a decade that I grow here, which means they're suited to my property, which is good. That was a can of paint falling. I just kicked it over at my breakfast bar. But sometimes I'll get lazy and be like, I know I can just buy Swiss chard and lettuce and it's not that expensive. Well, in the last few years, they've gone up to over $1 a plant. Like a 6-pack is $6. And that's a lot, but that's okay. Sometimes you're like, still, I didn't have to grow it. That takes time, right? This year I had a schedule well in advance, and we've got, I'm looking over there. I've got more Swiss chard than I've ever had ready to go into the ground. I've got lettuce, I've got fennel, I've got everything I need to put in as a seedling at this point, either started as seeds or I have it ready to transplant. And the only reason we're not transplanting it today is we're going to have 2 more cold nights this weekend, like in the 26 range. Tag, welcome to the live stream. And that means that I've been hardening them off, they're outside right now. That means I wanted to wait until that. And then we have a week of warm, and then it'll probably go below freezing again. And I have row cover I can put out. But that means that I'm not spending $6 a 6-pack for all of those. And that's a huge deal for me because usually what I do is about half and half. Now, I haven't started my tomatoes or all my peppers yet, but that's just because it's not time. I'm just starting peppers now, and tomatoes are going to start because my tomato growing system tends to grow them so fast that they're giant plants by the time it's time for transplant. I delay it till about mid-March, beginning of March, that sort of thing. So I'll probably get going with the tomatoes, not this weekend, which is my choir concert, but next weekend. Speaking of that, if you are in the Cookeville area and want to see The Creation, which is by Haydn, a classical composer, you can do it at Cookeville. So it's mastersingersinc.com is the website, mastersingersinc.com. Tickets are $15. It's a performance of The Creation and a few other pieces, but we are with 3 choirs and an orchestra. So it's going to be really awesome. We did a great rehearsal on Monday night where I was very entertained by the director, acting out the parts, because there's this part where God's creating the lions and the elephants and whatever. And what happens is the orchestra plays these sounds that sound like an elephant. And then the singer sings, and God created the elephants. And then plays a sound like lion. And then it's and God created the lion. So while we were going through it, the director's like, the orchestra won't care about this, but check this out. I'm going to nerd out with you for a minute. And he's like, So this is the lion, and like the accompanist is playing the lion part, and then the choir, the soloist sings about that. It's in English too, so this is a classical work you can see in English, which makes it I think a little more accessible. It just reminded me of Peter and the Wolf when he was doing that. It was hilarious. I wish we would have recorded that because that would have made really good promotional stuff for the concert. Anyway, Sunday 3 p.m. So if you're an old codger like I am, you can go to the concert, get out by 5, eat dinner out, and be home by 6:30 or 7. Kind of cool. That's at mastersingersinc.com. I'll actually throw that link in the show notes. It's not in my show notes. I wasn't planning to talk about it. The other thing I did under Operation Independence is Little Sheep was not supposed to come across a ram until she was a year old. And the ram got out, and she got out, and I suspected that maybe she was pregnant. So Little Sheep went on a car ride today to a veterinarian that usually comes to your pasture, but she has a farm in the area. And she was like, I'm really busy and I really want to work on my farm today. I'm like, I can bring this bottle fed lamb to you and we can do the ultrasound there. So she had an ultrasound and is in fact 3 months pregnant. So we'll be expecting 2 lambs in April, and that cost me $10, which is crazy because if I would have had her out here, it would have been like $80 or $90. So it's amazing what a quick ride in the car with a sheep can do. Also, riding in a car with a sheep is a little bit entertaining. I also got to shampoo the rug in the back of Tactical's Jeep after that because the anti-urine defense system failed. So we'll have to get a rubber mat down, I think, next time we have to do something like that. Okay, with that, it's time for the main topic of today's show, and that's small changes, big results. Tales from a barn underwater. The barn was underwater 2 weeks ago. And we don't use the barn much because, as most of you know, we do a regenerative approach to the sheep. So they're rotating through pasture all the time. And we don't bring them into the barn at night. They live with livestock guardian dogs. They actually prefer to be outside. Like if we give them access to the barn, unless it's snowing or something, they just sleep outside. They don't go in there. So that was actually the weirdest thing for me to learn about sheep here is that they're like, nah, we'd rather be out here, like, screw your shelter, lady. That's the way they are. Well, we had the biggest rain event here since 2010. And in 2010, we had one day with like 11 inches of rain, followed by a day with like somewhere between 8 and 12, depending where you were. I measured over 2 days a total of 22 inches of rain at my property. And that was the year that in the middle of the night, the Army Corps of Engineers opened the floodgates for Percy Priest Dam because the water was going to crest the dam, which is very dangerous, right? And at like 1:30 in the morning, people woke up to their stuff floating in their house and their beds about to be engulfed with water. People died, pets died. It was not a good thing. And because it was done in the middle of the night, people weren't really aware it was happening. And what was behind that is the Army Corps was trying not to release the water, but it was just too much water. Yeah, John Hathley says we had 18 inches of rain in Waverly in 2 hours in 2021. Yeah. So we didn't have quite that much here, John, but I estimate between 6 and 12 inches fell in a few hours in the morning that day. And here's how the weather cycle was going to be. We were going to get this rain event, and then that same night it was going to drop to 16 degrees, and it was going to snow the next day and then drop to 8 degrees. And when it's that cold and your sheep are not used to it, you do in fact want them to have access to shelter against wind, and they were going to be wet already. And I was like, they got to go back to the barn. So we'd already had them in the barn for the previous snow event, which also dropped to 8 degrees. And if you remember, we were delivering sheep during that. All of those little babies lived, by the way. And so there was hay all over the floor of the barn from that and poop from the sheep. And so our plan was to go over there and eat a frog. What do I mean by eat a frog? Eat a frog is when you just got to do something you don't really feel like doing or really want to do, but it's a thing that needs to be done. And usually it's not even that bad once you do it. And raking dry hay out of a barn, it's not fun, but you throw on a dust mask and you go for it. And so Tactical and I were like, okay, we're having coffee. We're going to go rake out the barn, move the material off site, compost it, and then we'll be ready to throw down more material for them so that we don't risk parasites from their poop being on the floor and that sort of thing. And he's like, I'll meet you over there. He goes with like the rakes, the shovels, the pitchfork, the trailer, like all of it. And I'm like, I'll be over in a bit. I have a rule as a woman homesteader that before you do anything on the homestead that involves needing to go out to the pasture or going to muck out the barn, right? You pee, even if you don't have to pee, because what's going to happen, even in an emergency, if the emergency is so stark that an animal's going to die in the 37 seconds it takes you to pee, then that animal is probably going to die anyway. And if not, and your help can help, you're going to spend an unpredictable number of hours in the pasture doing whatever it is you need to do. So just the rule was unload the bladder and then go out, so I don't have to figure out where in the pasture I'm going to go unload my bladder as soon as I get there. So I did that, went over. I go in the barn and I do notice that there was like, I actually took video of water pouring around the side of the barn and going down the creek a mile. I'm like, wow, the water, I haven't seen the water like this since 2010 when it happened. It was actually a little bit deeper in 2010. And I could just see it pouring down the hill and around the barn. It did not occur to me it was in the barn. And then I like slopped through the mud, went into the barn to start like raking. And I'm like, uh-oh, this looks a little wet in here. The creek was flowing through the barn, guys. So what I was seeing outside was also happening inside. And Tactical didn't even say a word to me. He just looks grumpy and he's scooping muddy hay, poopy hay into a trash bin, like a big trash bin. And I start on the other one, and it's like what I was expecting was to rake dry hay. It was going to be an unpleasant 45 minutes. Now I'm basically digging muddy, poopy hay out with a shovel and a rake, like raking it into a pile and then shoveling it. And it's heavier than just shoveling dirt, by the way. Like it sucked. And so I'm like in there, and he's like, I got to stop this water and blah, blah, blah. And he's really grumpy. And I'm like, okay, so, because I was just starting to also help. I'm like, what's the best thing for me to do? And he goes, I'm going to go empty this trash can of mud and hay and I'll bring it back. And if you can just get ready to shovel into it and just keep shoveling into this trash bin, I'll start dumping it and you start shoveling. And then, we could trade jobs when we're done. I was like, okay. So that's what I do. I get ready to shovel. And then I discovered it was easier to make a pile and scoop with my hands into the thing. So he just kept like rotating through with this trash bin. And I think he got a second one into the rotation. And then, I was shoveling. Well, there's a backstory on this. For the last 6 months, he's been noticing when he's over at the pasture and we get a lot of rain, like say 2 to 4 inches in a day, that the runoff line goes near the barn. And rather than turn and go into the pond and then overflow into the creek, it goes down to where he drives his four-wheeler. And so what he had done was look at that and realize that there used to be like a swale that diverted the water into the pond. And over the years, it's eroded because it was not maintained. And he started piling any extra logs he found at this one place where it made sense to divert that. So those logs were already there. And what he was doing, where he was dumping the buckets full of hay and mud and poop, was on those logs and at the base of those logs. So he basically had a skeletal framework of a quote unquote swale or a hill or whatever. I don't know what you want to call it. And it's not really a hugel because it didn't get covered. And he started dumping all of that material there. And what it did after about, so it took, I was maybe shoveling for 20 minutes, so not that long, because we also assessed that half the barn was dry and the other half wasn't. So we prioritized getting all the mucky stuff out of the wet side of the barn, and we closed off the 2 stalls that were flooded and just like we decided we're just not going to give the sheep access to that. We'll clean that out when it dries out. But by putting the material on those logs, he in essence moved an entire creek. And it was a rushing creek that was almost up to my knees, by the way. And it was coming down a steep hill, but he had already figured out the angle being a little diagonal and how it could like go into the barn and move the creek. All I know is I'm shoveling into the trash can and I'm not seeing anything outside. And then I did notice that the water was going down very quickly. And I was like, oh, cool. It's draining off, right? It didn't occur to me that he was moving a creek. So when we got that done, and he came back and helped me with like the last little bit of material that we moved out and ended up actually bringing that to the compost pile. And then he's like, okay, great. Let's give it about an hour to finish draining, and we should be good to go with setting up the barn for the sheep. And 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 I was like, what do you mean? He's like, well, I moved the creek, basically. He didn't say it that way. He's like, I diverted the water. He was very nerdy about it. And I look and I see what he did afterwards, and I was like, there is still water that's like the rest of the water that was on the lower part of the hill, but I realized that what he did was move a creek and helped him move a creek. And I took some video of just what the end of it looked like. And then we were going to put hay on the ground for them, but I don't know if you've been around when hay mixes with mud, it starts fermenting and it smells really bad, and who knows what will grow in that. So then I was a little worried about that. So I decided I was going to go use an old trick I learned, which was if you buy the pellet, he deserves a bonus. He got a good dinner that night, Dave. He got a good dinner. Well, he always gets a good dinner. If you buy the pellets that you put in the like in a wood stove for fuel, they turn into sawdust if they get wet. And so I was like, I'm going to go get like 10 bags of those things because they're not that expensive to scatter on the part of the barn that got wet. So it soaks it up and just turns into sawdust, because also it's about to be 16 degrees later today. And then it's going to snow. And then, it's going to be like frozen, awful, fermenting hay, which doesn't sound very healthy or sanitary to me. So I drove to Tractor Supply, and those bags were like $13 a bag. And what they had was intended for like smokers for cooking your food. And I was like thinking, well, it's going to be $130 basically when I get 10 of these bags. But, the sheep are worth it. But dang, that's more than I thought I was going to spend. And then I found that they make pine pellets for horse stall bedding. And that was half the price. So I spent $70 on that and drove back, stopped because I'm driving by the barn every time. It's a 10th of a mile from my house. Stop at the barn, unloaded those into the barn, scattered them around before I went home, kept 2 bags because it only took 8 bags for like any other need we might have. And the barn ended up looking pretty good. I made a short video about that. If you check out my like YouTube or TikTok shorts, you'll see this is what the barn looks like after the flooding. So we, in one day, moved the creek, got the barn cleaned out, dried in for the sheep, and set up so they could go there that night. And it seems like a big thing. It was a big result because as a result, the sheep had somewhere where they could stay. And the creek is now permanently diverted that comes down that hill when it's creaking. It's a wet weather creek is probably the best way to describe it. But it was like in the end, a very small effort. Like it was not even all that physically demanding. I mean, we're talking about somebody with a back issue that causes him not to be able to do a lot of things. And me, shoveling. And, because he was driving and dumping off the trailer. over a 20-minute period of time. And that was the result. Like a giant, like the barn won't flood anymore, except for now it will because it got ripped out, the thing that happened. But the barn won't flood anymore with that in place. That's it. And I am sure that at some time in the past, the barn didn't flood because somebody else had figured out that there needs to be a little berm here so that the barn doesn't flood. That's it. So the end result is we know what needs to be done to keep that area dry. And yeah, Dave says EPA doesn't need to know. Well, we did not divert water from the creek at all. It's like literally going into the creek the way it originally went into the creek. But also, like those sorts of things in this state are a little less weird than like rainwater catchment being causing you to have to go to the Supreme Court over it in Oregon or whatever. Yeah, totally different thing. But then as I got to thinking about it, I'm like, at the end of the day, I was tired. And as I said, we had a good dinner. And I know that we sat and we watched a show that night on TV, which, we do that probably 4 or 5 nights a week when it's like the end of the day, a 45-minute TV show, and then that's it. That's sort of like the wind down time. So we watched a show, and I was like, actually, I feel really good about today. Like, past me would have been thinking how awful it was that the barn flooded and we had to move a creek and drive to the store and spend money and put bedding down and whatever, like all of that work. Present me thinks it was kind of cool that we had the skills and the knowledge to make basically the smallest possible change and have that big of a result. Like that was a very satisfying day, as a matter, even though I didn't do anything I planned to do around the homestead. I was like, we're going to clean out the barn and then I'm going to, make breakfast sausage or what. I don't, there was some kitchen thing I was going to do that day that probably canned tomatoes. Those are all canned now, by the way. So life is like that, where if you make small changes, they can often have a much bigger result than if you make a big change. By which I mean making a small change every day does so much better for you than making one big change on Saturday once a week, right? And that's why I developed the My Three Things method. Is it's like 3 little things maximum. Not, you don't commit to more than 3 every single day so that you move forward over time. You start by setting where you want to move forward to, and then all of those things align on that. And yeah, so Scott says epic success because water is powerful and it doesn't care. Water is going to go where, well, it's going to go downhill, right? Life is like that too. Your life is going to, if you don't set up the small habits and the small changes every day, your life is going to go where it wants to go. And that's when we start feeling like our life is being lived for us rather than we're living our life. Because the best thing about living life is that it's a journey. And if you enjoy the journey, then you have a great life. And if you fight the journey, then you don't have a great life. Or if you hate the journey, right? A lot of people are like, I can't wait until I get X. And I understand that. Like, I can't wait until my property has a proper event center, right? Because we're always like doing classes in the classroom, basement classroom. And I have this outdoor hangout area that's really cool. But wouldn't it be cool if you could just kind of flow in and out of the classroom? And that's the long-term plan. But I can't wait till that happens, right? Well, like the story of us getting there by having some events every year that make a little bit of profit, and then we're able to fold that into making it a better event space every year is much more engaging, much more satisfying. And because we've taken our time, we have a better idea of how we want it set up. And that's, I think, the biggest lesson of things like knowing where to put the berm so the creek moves, right? It's kind of like the trim tab on a rudder of a large ship is, to move that rudder takes a lot of energy. But they figured out they could put this little like mini rubber, it's called a rudder, it's called a trim tab, that it moves, and then it makes it so the rudder can move with a whole lot less power, which then turns the entire giant ocean liner. So when you're approaching big problems in life, look for the trim tab. What's the little thing I can do every day that helps with this problem, rather than throw everything to the, sometimes you do have to throw everything to the dogs, right? But usually you don't. Usually it's like, okay, I have problem X, not enough money. How do I get more money? That's one question. Um, how do I spend less money? That's a different question. How do I make it so that whatever I do create brings enough value over time that it's not always my scramble after money, but I'm creating value and bringing value, and it becomes a sustainable system? Hmm. It's going to take habits every single day. That's what it's going to take. And that's what I mean by small changes, big results, right? In the end, small changes every day make the biggest difference in your world. And it could be as simple as not obsessing on what the latest headlines um, about Trump's changes in this or that, or USAID being defunded, or whatever. What's being, it's like the what's his name? I can't remember. It's a brain fart, right? The lists are coming out, I guess, for what's his name, who had the Epstein. The Epstein list is purportedly going to be released today. You know how many times they said that's going to happen in like the last 3 years, and it hasn't. So somebody put a thing about, I was like, I'll believe it when I see it. Like, maybe this is the time, but do I need to sit glued to the news about that? No. You know what I can do in that time instead? I can like clear off my hillside garden, or I can, I've got lamb meat to grind, or I can, set up another tray of seedlings so I have a whole tray of dill, because I love dill. You can never grow too much dill, in my opinion. I can get my swales in order. I can do all sorts of different things. And those tiny changes do two things for me. One, I'm being active, so I get more activity. You know what happens when your body does more? You start feeling better over time physically. If you work out every single day, it helps over time. If you overwork out every single day, that can hurt. But my version of workout and overworking out are two very different things. You know what I mean? But in the end, that small change every day makes the biggest difference. And you can ask Angry Pepper about that, right? So Angry Prepper realized he was overweight, and he started taking a 15-minute walk after each meal. So that means like lunch break at work, you eat your sandwich or whatever you're eating. He didn't even change his diet like the way I have. Like, he just ate normal food and then went for a 15-minute walk in New York. And as a result of that, started seeing some big changes. So if your struggle is weight, just choose one meal and add a 15-minute walk off it. And then when that's a good habit, choose a second one every day and add that 15-minute walk. It can make a big, big difference over time. And I didn't realize how big it was until I actually, like, I know that being active makes a big difference. I got this Fitbit thingy, and it gives me like sort of real-time data. And it's amazing like what your heart rate does when you're on a good vigorous walk, and how many calories you're burning and all of those things just by being active, which is different than most of us are when we have more of a seated job. Jason says, I started what I called my 100. I break things down into 100 square foot areas and do one at a time. Helps me manage my big projects. Yeah, big projects can get really overwhelming. And that's why I do the My 3 Things method. They can get overwhelming. Like, every time I do Self-Reliance Festival, at the stage I'm at right now, which is that we haven't scheduled all our speakers and we haven't really rolled out the marketing yet. It's going to start rolling out, like some pre-marketing is now starting to roll out. We'll just put it that way. Right now, it seems like a big impossible event as I look from the outside. Hi, Roar Tribe. Is it M or Patrick? Just curious. So it seems impossible, but I know that if I just keep chipping away one thing at a time, I'll be like, why did I feel like this was impossible 6 months ago? But yeah, big projects can be really amorphous. Anyway, hi, Em. Welcome. Good to hear from you. I heard from your husband today too. So just remember that. A small change is much more important than a big one, particularly if you're integrating that small change every single day. You can move creeks, you can move mountains, or you can just build the life you choose on your terms. With that, if you like the show and want to support the work I do here, you can do it in two ways. One, get your coffee at hollerroast.com. Two, consider becoming a member. Find out more about that at livingfreeintennessee.com. With that, guys, go out, make it a great week.